everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Vital Descent. I'm your host, Patrick McFarlane. This one is episode 244. Show notes may be found at vitaldescent.com/244. This one is entitled The New Arms Race. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about a bunch of old civil defense manuals that my grandma gave me for Christmas that belonged to my uncle, or not my uncle, my grandpa. And some of these are just really incredible, and I'm going to be showing you a lot of these. Most of them are from the 50s, but if you don't subscribe on YouTube or Odyssey, or if you don't know that there's a video version of this show, you can search Vital Descent with Patrick McFarlane or just Vital Descent, and you can probably find them. Otherwise, they're posted in the show notes page as well. But I'm also going to be talking about some recent news and developments that have been going on in the last few weeks, the last month here, signifying an increased new arms race, just a general theme that I'm identifying, and also ever increasing military cooperation between the United States and Japan and other Pacific, Western aligned Pacific nations that are putting more and more pressure on China. Of course, we have the simmering conflict in Ukraine that could ramp up here in the next couple weeks with some Russian advances potentially. So I wanted to apologize to everyone because I've been sparse in putting out content lately. Last week, I came down with an incredibly severe case of strep throat, and it abscessed, and I almost went into the hospital. So I have a fairly good reason for not putting out an episode, although I didn't miss a day of lawyer work. So take that as you will. But the last couple of weeks have just been incredibly difficult, just to balance everything and try to, push forward with everything while being in kind of ill health. So really gives you kind of perspective going through that situation. And I'm just glad that I'm on the mend. I'm on some like super high dose antibiotics, but I see a nurse practitioner, and he looked in my mouth and he was like, "Holy shit. Like you're not in good shape, bud." So, that's just the way it goes. Just because you're sick doesn't mean the work stops or that your clients don't, stop needing you. So, all right. Well, with I guess to preface this, to tell a little story, I've talked about my grandfather before on the podcast. He was a John Bircher, and of course, the John Birch Society started in Appleton, Wisconsin, which is where my grandpa was from. Now, I don't think that he was involved with kind of the early days of the John Birch Society. I think he was in his 20s in the 50s. And I can't remember exactly when the John Birch Society started, but he might have been kind of I don't know if they started in the 40s or 50s, and could look that up, but I won't. You guys can do that. And he might have got in kind of at the groundswell of the organization growing. But I believe it was this grandfather, because my great-grandfather had a property in Wisconsin, and he had built a fallout shelter in the backyard, and the fallout shelter is still there. But I always remember growing up and kind of looking in the backyard, and there's this stainless steel rectangular square that's on the ground, and always wondered, in this area you have a lot of private septic systems, right? I always thought maybe it had something to do with the septic or something like that, but nope. You take off this rectangular stainless steel kind of plate thing, and underneath it was a really heavy concrete, circular manhole cover looking thing. And when I was growing up, I always kind of thought it was for tornadoes, right? Because you get some severe weather in Wisconsin. It's not like, Kansas or Oklahoma or Texas or anything like that, but you do get tornadoes occasionally, and they've occasionally come kind of near the house. But I've never gone, so I asked my dad about it and my grandma about it, and she's like, "Well, it's a fallout shelter. It's a fallout shelter." And There's some places too, like if you go into old courthouses, there's one in Chippewa County, Wisconsin, that if you go in, there's radioactive fallout, like a symbol, a badge in the top corner. And the courthouse itself was built kind of in that era. So if you go into that courthouse and go down, downstairs, there's signs saying it's a radiation shelter, a fallout shelter. And so I thought it was really interesting. I've never been able to go down there. I guess my dad has gone down there at some point before I was born. But I mean, you're talking about something that's 50 plus years old, I think is when it was first constructed. And he said it's pretty sturdy. I mean, it's a fallout shelter. So I think that he had ringed it with concrete and things like that. I don't know if there's rebar or anything inside of it or what exactly it's created with, but it's a sturdy structure. And he said that, you go down the ladder and it's kind of on the side of a hill, and you go down the ladder and you go in there, and there's not enough. I don't know if there's enough room to stand up, maybe if you're a shorter person, but he's like, there's bunk beds and stuff in there. And before I die, I got a whole lot of time yet, I hope. But I'd like to go down there and take a look at it. Again, I don't know how dangerous it is or not. But yeah, so that's always been something that's been there all of my childhood, my entire life, knowing that that's there. And my grandma has a bunch of, because my grandpa died in 94 or something like that. And he left behind a bunch of books and a whole bunch of stuff. And like I said, I've talked on the show about how he would write op-eds in the local newspaper talking about, he wrote an op-ed in opposition to the Gulf War, Desert Storm, talking about how, us conservatives, we won't be fooled twice. You fooled us with Vietnam, but we're not going to be fooled twice. And the president has these business interests and kind of John Bircher stuff, but talking good language about not burning, blood and treasure in the Middle East and staying out of those affairs. And I have it. It's in I have the clipping. I think I've shared on the show before, but it's in my copy of Fool's Errand. I just put it in there. But she came for Christmas and she brought all of this literature in this manila envelope. And it's all civil defense manual stuff. Of course, let's see here. The address is, the manila envelope is from the National Rifle Association, which is funny. And it just says civil defense info on the top. And there's a bunch of them, but I'm just going to show some of them for the show. I mean, they're super vintage, like Fallout 4 kind of looking aesthetic. And you can see in the bottom, it says reprinted September 1958. For those of you not watching, it says what you should know about radioactive fallout from the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization. Revised May 1958, reprinted September 1958. So, and some of it, let's see, this one is just kind of pretty basic. There's not a whole lot of graphics or anything like that. But part of the reason why I tied this into the new arms race is just I've been thinking lately, and there's some projects that I'm trying to work on kind of in the background. But one of the ideas behind a certain piece that I was thinking of doing was, and I've commented on this on the show before, kind of this, and I talked about it with Richard Cox in the last interview too, which I hope you enjoyed, by the way. This disconnect between, back in the Cold War, it was foremost in the American conscience, or at least it seems to me, a huge part of American culture, that we could be nuked and all die in nuclear holocaust at any moment, just dead. And I don't know if it seemed to be implanted in the public consciousness artificially, or if it was just the nature of the times and people took this a lot more seriously. But at this point in time right now, we're objectively closer to that event happening, and people just don't really seem to care or know or be aware of it or anything like that. And part of why I'm showing everyone this is because just as examples of how foremost it seemed in the public consciousness this was. So, I mean, of course, these are civil defense manuals. But here's another one, the 6th U.S. Army Radiological Monitors Guide. So talking about alpha and beta particles and gamma radiation. So I thought that was really cool. And then you get this little cool 1950s illustration on the back of a man showering in a makeshift decontamination setup in the basement. And cool stuff like this, the basic measurement techniques and monitoring surveys, radiation symbols. So that's a cool little pamphlet. More discussion in here. Here's rules of thumb. They say the following simple rules may be used to estimate radiation dosage and dose rates versus time for fission product decay. 1. Double the time dose the rate is 1/2. Double the time dose rate is 1/2. 2. For short time exposure, assume a constant dose rate. 3. Gamma dose, 5 times dose rate times time after detonation. Little math equations that most Americans probably couldn't compute nowadays. Here's one that's really cool. A message to you from the president from JFK, September 1961. And this looks like it was kind of clipped out of a magazine or something like that. But I'll read the letter. You know, what you must learn. So I'll read the letter from JFK, and you know, the most we've gotten from Biden, it seems to me, is just saying an admission that while we're closer to nuclear war now than we were or as close as we were at the Bay of Pigs. JFK says, "My fellow Americans, nuclear weapons and the possibility of nuclear war are facts of life we cannot ignore today." You imagine a president saying that today? "I do not believe that war can solve any of the problems facing the world today, but the decision is not ours alone. The government is moving to improve the protection afforded you in your communities through civil defense. We have begun and will be continuing throughout the next year and a half a survey of all public buildings with fallout shelter potential, and the marking of those with adequate shelter for 50 persons or more. We are providing fallout shelter in new and in some existing federal buildings. We are stocking these shelters with 1 week's food and medical supplies and 2 weeks' water supply for the shelter occupants. In addition, I have recommended to the Congress the establishment of food reserves in centers around the country where they might be needed following an attack. Finally, we are developing improved warning systems which will make it possible to sound attack warnings on buzzers right in your homes and places of business." More comprehensive measures than these lie ahead, but they cannot be brought to completion in the immediate future. In the meantime, there is much that you, can do to protect yourself, and in doing so, strengthen your nation. I urge you to read and consider seriously the contents of this issue of Life, so it's Life magazine. The security of our country and the peace of the world are the objectives of our policy. But in these dangerous days, when both these objectives are threatened, we must prepare for all eventualities. The ability to survive, coupled with the will to do so, therefore, are essential to our country. Fallout shelters. You could be among the 97% to survive if you follow advice on these pages. How to build shelters, where to hide in cities, and what to do during an attack. So, really interesting. I'm sure people could find this Life article online. Just kind of a picture of a shelter there. Got the kids and the family. Here's another one, Civil Defense and Vocational Education handout book. And this one is just text, so I won't really show too much else. These illustrations are really cool and are kind of, they're Fallout 4 vintage kind of style. Very cool. Civil Defense Supplement to the American Red Cross First Aid Textbook. So not exactly Fallout particular, or nuclear war particular here, but I guess useful nonetheless. Here's a cool one. Fallout protection for homes with basements. Department of Defense, Office of Civil Defense. And here's an address from LBJ. It is already clear that without fallout shelter protection for our citizens, all defense weapons lose much of their effectiveness in saving lives. This also appears to be the least expensive way of saving millions of lives, and the one which has clear value even without other systems. We will continue our existing programs and start a program to increase the total inventory of shelters through a survey of private home and other small structures. So that was an excerpt from an address to Congress. So it's kind of cool stuff. And again, like I'm just with the level of public outreach that occurred back then. I mean, you would really think that we would be hearing more right now. And of course, playing up the risk of nuclear war probably doesn't go super well for it's hard to spin for arming Ukraine. It seems to me that you have to circle that square in some way. Here's another one. There's no date on the front. July 1957. Facts about the H-bomb that could save your life. A pamphlet. Federal Defense Administration. So, facts about Mike's shot of Operation Ivy. It's a really cool one. Here's one that's cool. The Family Fallout Shelter. So, a guide to building your own fallout shelter. I love these illustrations too. They're just very cool. Here is Family Food Stockpile for Survival, U.S. Department of Agriculture. And it really does, I mean, I say this over and over again, but it really does strike you when you're looking at these how different it seems the outreach was in terms of the level of things that are expected from people and the level of competency that is assumed of the general public. Personal preparedness in the nuclear age. Student manual. So maybe this, I'm guessing maybe this is the stuff that my grandpa had to read for us. I assume he was in the Civil Defense Force. Just kind of illustrations here. And one thing that really kind of piqued my interest too was this little one, things to do under atomic, biological, or chemical attack. November 1957. Talking about the U.S. Army Chemical Corps and some of the work that I've done specifically on the... Wait, this is the first thing I showed, I think. I love that way that old paper smells. Old books and old paper. So this would be pretty useful coming up in the future here. Can you believe how much stuff there is? How much stuff he had? Fallout protection. What to know and do about nuclear attack. Now, one question that I really kind of wonder is how, and maybe if there's older people that listen to this podcast who were alive during this time and kind of knew what things were like at the time, if they could say how the average person, how involved were they in in this information? And how seriously did the average person take this? And did they take it seriously enough to actually construct their own fallout shelters? It's really interesting. Some of these would be cool to get tattoos of. Here's some first aid. Very cool. I hope this is interesting enough to listen to on the podcast. But like I said, if you haven't watched the video version of this, go on over to vitaldescent.com/244 and check it out. Here's another one, Civil Defense Technical Bulletin. I'm just kind of the same thing here. So this one, 50 cents special. How to survive atomic attack. All about fallout. Special, the horror of an atomic explosion. Photos of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Maybe we can find some of that. And there's a lot of, here's like a complete floor plan here. The attack signals. When the siren sounds, a steady blast of 3 to 5 minutes means attack probable. I guess that's what they had all set up. Now I assume you would get, incoming missile attack notice on your phone or something like that. Well, that's everything that was in the envelope. So just glad that I could get a chance to kind of share these with everybody, because I've never seen, at least had never seen this stuff from my grandpa before, which is really cool. So I'm really glad. Thanks, Grandma, for thinking of me, and cool little Christmas present there. Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of 2. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome plaid shirt that's in there, a flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker, really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldescent.com/stitch fix. You can also get Vital Descent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Descent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldescent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel. And I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldescent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at @PatMcFarland_, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks. So one thing that I've noticed in the news a lot, lately, as much as I've been able to pay attention, because oddly enough, it wasn't just getting sick and really sick, but business really picked up after the holiday. And I think it's probably because, everyone is trying to forget about their legal problems or just get through the last Christmas with the kids. And then they get through it and time to take care of business, right? So there's historical parallels to what we're going through right now. And of course, everything relates to World War II, which is kind of the cliche from everyone who denounces Vladimir Putin, of course, that he's the new Hitler. Everyone is the new Hitler. We talked about that in the last episode with Kosovo and Slobodan Milosevic being the new Hitler. And I learned a lot about the U.S. involvement before World War II from this book, Great Wars and Great Leaders, A Libertarian Rebuttal by Ralph Raico. Now, I know that Pat Buchanan, who I believe has just retired from writing his columns, he has that great book about World War II. Winston, Churchill, FDR, and the Unnecessary War. And I'm sure, I haven't had a chance to actually sit down and read it, but I'm sure that it has a lot of stuff in there about U.S. pre-involvement before World War II, with the Allied side. And of course, we had the Lend-Lease program and all these things that made the United States, even before World War I too, all these things that preceded U.S. involvement in the war. And of course, the parallels should be apparent to everybody. And one of the parallels is we have this great piece by Connor Eccles at Responsible Statecraft. It is, by the numbers, keeping track of the single largest arms transfer in U.S. history. Washington has given billions of dollars worth of weapons to Ukraine, a timeline of what and when, and the price tag since the start of the war. So this is really, for all you out there, this is a really indispensable resource that you should bookmark. He just updated it 2 days ago. And in here is the whole timeline. So if you're writing pieces or needing to get something like that, just go into here and you can see what was announced and when it was announced. So, Connor's written a few pieces, I think, about how the U.S. military is concerned about its stockpiles, and some of the Western nations are concerned about their stockpiles as well. But he writes, since Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. has now sent nearly $27 billion worth of military aid to support Kiev's war effort, according to the Department of Defense. Now, of course, that $27 billion does not include the budgetary assistance, and most of the assistance to Ukraine is not in direct military assistance. It is in budgetary assistance, like literally paying for Ukraine's government to function. And that's one of the big arguments against people will say, oh, well, Ukraine has their own right to fight. They're invaded. It's their call. Well, the United States, the Ukrainian resistance wouldn't exist without the United States. So as long as we're footing the bill, I think we better have a say. So with the constant flow of news, it can be hard to keep track. First, this list only contains publicly announced info. The Pentagon admitted on August 11th to sending at least one type of missile that had not been previously mentioned in their press releases, so there's reason to believe that this list is not exhaustive. Second, there are 3 different sources for these lethal aid packages, one of which has made up the vast majority of transfers to date, is known as a presidential drawdown. This means that the White House and Pentagon agree to send weapons to Ukraine from U.S. stockpiles, after which DoD can use the funds to replenish their stocks by purchasing new arms from defense contractors. Biden has used this authority in unprecedented 18 times in order to send weapons to Ukraine, with most of the funding coming from money that Congress has set aside to arm Kiev. So the second source of weapons is the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, or USAI. This is a special fund within the Pentagon's budget that is used to purchase new weapons from contractors rather than drawing from existing stockpiles. Transfers from these funds do not require additional approval of Congress, which is interesting. So the third category is foreign military financing, or FMF. This program provides grants or loans to close U.S. partners that are often earmarked for specific weapons purchases. In essence, it lowers barriers for foreign countries that want to buy arms from American defense manufacturers and gives them the money needed to finance purchases. So I just wanted to read that because I think it's, as you're trying to, just like anyone else, trying to understand exactly what's going on and how the U.S. is involved in the ways that it's involved. This is really a basic, indispensable, education about how that's taking place. And of course, the figures are here to back it up as well. And what discussion of the new arms race would be complete, without starting there. So I'm not going to go deep into the specifics of that Connor Eccles piece because you can look at the numbers yourself, but just broad brush strokes. There's talking of the U.S., supplying more HIMARS, supplying more and more artillery ammunition, bringing some our stockpiles low, and these Stryker armored personnel carriers, which and these Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, which are armored vehicles that are smaller than full tanks, but are similar to tanks that might have some effect on the ground, but ultimately, people like Douglas McGregor say that they won't. And these HARM missiles, the high-speed anti-radiation missiles that are fired from planes to destroy enemy radar. So these weapons packages just having no end in sight and constantly escalating as the situation grows more and more dire to Ukraine. Now we have this piece from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com dated January 12th. So it's a couple weeks old. But U.S. Navy Secretary saying arming both the U.S. and Ukraine might become challenging. That's Carlos del Toro saying, Navy Secretary, saying a couple weeks ago that it might become challenging for the U.S. military to continue arming itself as it continues to pour weapons into Ukraine unless the arms industry can significantly boost production. So we have the huge boon going to weapons manufacturers like, Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin. And we have, this other article here, if you want to parse down on it, 24/7 Wall Street special report lists the fastest growing weapons manufacturers in the world. And another theme of this, right, is that it's not just the United States that is on an arms race. It's the rest of the world too, which should be pretty damn concerning. But 25, the West's concern over Russia has generated a boom in military spending, especially in the U.S., which is home to a dozen of the world's 25 fastest growing arms producing and military services companies. And so it goes through their methodology. Here's an interesting one, and I don't know if this is true or not, but this is the claim that they make. State-owned China State Shipbuilding Corporation is the world's fastest growing military manufacturer, growing its defense-related revenue by 114% to $11.1 billion between 2017 and 2021. About 21% of their business is military-related. And of course, that is most likely a reaction to the U.S. pressure in the South China Sea in those areas that we've talked about ad nauseum. But it says Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman have by far the largest defense-related operations on our list, with 2021 defense-related revenue around $60 billion and $30 billion respectively. The rest have far smaller arms and military services operations. 19 companies had $5 billion and under defense-related revenue in 2021. So Chinese weapon manufacturers growing at the fastest rate, but by far American Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman really being the largest. So Dave writes, going back to that Carlos Del Toro piece, the majority of the weapons being sent to Ukraine are used on land and come from U.S. Army stockpiles themselves. Although the Pentagon did just announce it's sending ship-based Sea Sparrow missiles. But Del Toro said the Navy was still concerned about if the arms industry could meet its demands. There was a journalist asking if the Navy was at the point where it had to choose between arming itself or Ukraine. He said, yeah, that's always a concern for us, and we monitor that very, very closely. I wouldn't say we're quite there yet, but if the conflict goes on for another 6 months, for another year, it certainly continues to stress the supply chain in ways that are challenging. The U.S. has already pledged over $20 billion in just military equipment alone to Ukraine since Russia invaded and is sending an enormous amount of ammunition to the country. The policy is a boon for the arms industry, and extraordinary measures are being taken to boost production, including granting the Pentagon wartime purchasing powers. So, I mean, what does that say about where we're at? Del Toro mentioned that some of the steps being taken to boost production are coordinated by Kathleen Hicks, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Purchasing powers granted to the Pentagon by the 23 NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, allow non-competitive multi-year contracts for certain arms, most of which are made by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, the former employer of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. So it's important to note, and Dave rightly brings it up all the time, that Raytheon is the former employer of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. He was on their board. So you can see kind of how that works. Now, here's another step of it. A lot of this is centered around China because, of course, China remains the ultimate long-term threat against the United States, according to the Blob. Another article by Dave DeCamp earlier this month, January 11th, U.S.-Japan announced steps to strengthen military cooperation against China. The U.S. will sell Japan long-range missiles, deploy Marines with anti-ship missiles to Okinawa, and extend mutual defense commitments to space. So this was announced by, it was announced after Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with their Japanese counterparts in Washington earlier this month. The meeting came after the government of Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida rolled out a new national security strategy that names China its top challenge. So this is, of course, was the biggest development that I knew I had to bring to the show this week. Reflecting similar language used by the Pentagon, his government also announced a plan to double military spending by 2027. The ministers welcomed the release of their respective national security strategies and national defense strategies and confirmed unprecedented alignment of their vision, priorities, and goals, Blinken, Austin, and their Japanese counterparts said in a joint statement. They said that they agreed China's foreign policy seeks to reshape the international order to its benefit and to employ China's growing political, economic, military, and technological power to that end, and that this, quote, behavior is of serious concern to the alliance, of course. Austin reaffirmed that Japan falls under the protection of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Japan and the U.S. remain united in our concern over China's destabilizing actions, and I want to reaffirm the U.S.'s ironclad commitment to defend Japan with the full range of capabilities, including nuclear, he said. The U.S. welcomed Japan's plan to counterstrike capabilities by purchasing U.S.-made Tomahawk missiles, which have a range of about 1,000 miles. Acquiring the weapons breaks from Japan's post-World War II constitution that restricted its military to self-defense capabilities. Now, I did talk about this with Richard Cox a little bit in the last show, and he did say that a lot of people assume that the Japanese constitution did limit the militarization of Japan. However, the research that he's done has shown that that's not true. But the important thing to note is that this is unequivocally an increase of whatever existed before. This is a new development. And of course, the development aims to double Japan's defense spending by military spending by 2027. So if you see here, here's a big old map of Japan there, just to kind of cement it in your eyes. We have South Korea being closer to China than Japan. Of course, not Okinawa and things like that. But we'll talk a little bit more about South Korea because there's a lot of developments there too, and conflict with North Korea that we covered a bit when the last time Kyle Anzalone was on the show, just giving us a background on Korea. So if you want to find that, go over to vitaldescent.com and just search Kyle or Korea or something like that. Let's see here. But yeah, so there's a temporary deployment of Reaper drones, U.S. Reaper drones, to the Kanoya Air Base in southern Japan's Kagoshima Prefecture. The point of the deployment is to raise maritime domain awareness in the East China Sea, an area of tension between Japan and China. And we've talked a lot too in pieces that I've written about how U.S. spy plane flights surveil the Chinese coast. So that's just a further kind of development in that direction. U.S. and Japan will sign a new agreement on cooperation in space. It will pledge the U.S. to defend Japanese assets in space. That's great. Meaning the U.S. will be obligated to go to war in response to an attack on Japanese satellites. That's like the Senkaku Islands, in the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. These uninhabited pieces of dirt that we're committed to defend. So we do, let's see, more agreements could be announced this Friday. This was a couple weeks ago. The Japanese leader was in London and signed a military pact with the new UK Prime Minister, Sunak, Rishi Sunak, that will allow the deployment of British troops in Japan. Which is just really interesting. And then here's another one. Kyle Anzalone wrote about this too at the Libertarian Institute. But here's another piece by Dave DeCamp talking about this. U.S. boosting aid to the Micronesia in exchange for more military access. So these Micronesia, the Federated States of Micronesia, all these islands, kind of near where a little bit southward of where the U.S. was island hopping during the war in the Pacific in World War II. But the U.S. trying to get closer defense-based commitments to Taiwan and China. But not, as far as I understand, they've been having some trouble with the nations that are nearest to China because they don't want to be involved in some kind of new arms race and military standoff buildup. But these Micronesia states, this is the new development. So giving more economic aid to Micronesia in exchange for more U.S. military access to the islands. The deal, and I don't know if this was signed since Dave wrote this article, but it will be an extension of an agreement the U.S. has with several Pacific Island nations known as the Compact of Free Association. Under these deals, the Pacific countries are treated similarly to U.S. territories. They receive economic assistance from the U.S. and fall under the protection of the U.S. military in exchange for allowing U.S. forces to operate in the countries. So we know what happens in these foreign military bases. I mean, there's oil spills that happen. I mean, look at Hawaii and the natives and what's going on there, and the water getting tainted from the fuel storage facilities there that have been leaking into the groundwater, tainting the groundwater. All the pollution that I know Abby Martin has been involved. I don't know if she went to Okinawa too and talked about, how locals there just hate the U.S. presence, bases and presence there. But you get all these perks and you get to be under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, which is great. The U.S. is also allowed to deny other foreign militaries access to the Pacific Island nations. Extending the agreements and other U.S. military expansion plan for the region is viewed in Washington as vital to the U.S. and their plans to confront China. So this islands nation, I think, will receive $140 million in annual grants from the U.S., an increase of $50 million from current levels. He said residents should expect an increase in U.S. military activity over the next few years. How would you like to hear that? Exercises will begin increasing in frequency, and while they are ultimately in the national interest and in the interest of our nation's security, it is important that our citizens know about them well in advance so that they don't see these activities and then immediately fear the worst. Why would they fear the worst? So the U.S. is also nearing deals with the Marshall Islands and Palau on extending their Compact of Free Association agreements. The Associated Press reported Saturday that the U.S. has already signed memorandums of understanding with the Marshall Islands and Palau, and that a final deal is expected to be signed by the spring. So another piece that I brought up kind of outlining this too is interestingly from CNN. Why Asia's Arms Race Risks Spinning Out of Control by Brad Lendon. I'm not familiar with this individual. Senior global military affairs writer based in Seoul, South Korea. So he has a bunch of pieces there. But it's interesting coming from CNN. Of course, you'll get some spin here. Seoul, South Korea. It's an arms race bigger than anything Asia has ever seen. 3 major nuclear powers and one fast-developing one. The world's 3 biggest economies and decades-old alliances all vying for an edge in some of the world's most contested land and sea areas. In one corner are the U.S. and its allies, Japan and South Korea. In another corner, China and its partner, Russia. And in a third, North Korea. That's interesting. With each wanting to be one step ahead of the others, all are caught in a vicious circle that is spinning out of control. After all, one man's deterrence is another man's escalation, which is true. Not too bad so far. We'll continue to see these dynamics spiral in East Asia, where we have no measures of restraint. We have no arms control. And Kit Panda, a nuclear policy expert at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, told CNN. The visit of Japanese leaders to Washington over the past week only served to highlight the point. On Friday, fresh from a meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida expressed his concern over China's military activities in the East China Sea and the launch of ballistic missiles over Taiwan that landed in waters near Japan in August. It's interesting. Now, I don't know if he's calling it the East China Sea, which is, I don't know if that's the technical, if there's a discrepancy based on exactly where he's talking about, if it's the East China Sea or the South China Sea or something like that. But the Indo-Pacific is what the U.S. calls it, and he didn't use that term. Kishida warned Beijing against trying to change the international order and said it was absolutely imperative for Japan, the U.S., and Europe to stand united on China. His words came just days after U.S. and Japanese ministers had spoken ominously of the, quote, ongoing and accelerating expansion of China's nuclear arsenal. Yet, according to North Korea and China, it is Japan who is the aggressor. They have seen Tokyo pledge recently to double its defense spending while acquiring weapons capable of hitting targets inside Chinese and North Korean territory. That's the Tomahawk missiles that we were talking about in Dave DeCamp's piece. And their alleged concerns will only have grown with the announcement just days ago of plans for new U.S. Marine deployments on Japan's southern islands, including new mobile anti-ship missiles meant to thwart any first strike from Beijing. To the U.S. and Japan, such moves are about deterrence, but to Beijing, they are escalation. So here's some interesting background. I don't want to read this article verbatim, but it gives historical context. Of course, the specter of Japan returning to its pre-World War II colonial expansionism, which is incredibly concerning to China historically. When Japanese forces controlled vast swaths of Asia and China bore the brunt. Some 14 million Chinese died and up to 100 million became refugees during the 8 years of conflict with Japan from 1937 to 1945. Beijing insists the plans are threaten peace. But of course, critics suspect China has a secondary motive in dredging up historical wounds, which is distracting from its own military buildup. They point out that even as Beijing vociferously rejects U.S. and Japanese concerns about its own burgeoning military might, It has been growing its naval and air forces in areas near Japan while claiming the Senkaku Islands, an uninhabited Japanese-controlled chain in the East China Sea, as its sovereign territory. So, also talking about Chinese patrols that have gone through these island areas that have been increasing since 2012. So little disputes there. Also, closer alliances with Russia, which that this closeness has not only spurred some of the US-Japan agreements, but that Russia's invasion of Ukraine had, quote, moved things on warp drive, given how Russia President Vladimir Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping had showcased their close relationship in the lead up to the Beijing Olympics. And a week-long live fire exercise in the East China Sea, a joint exercise between Russia and China that occurred in December. And of course, the article goes over Taiwan and Xi Jinping not ruling out taking the island by force. It does mention Pelosi's visit, but doesn't really say that that's what provoked this response. But it does talk about how there's a new era of military tension across the island, Taiwan. Now, here's another angle on North Korea. 1,000 miles to the north of Taiwan, talk of cooperation on the Korean Peninsula is a faint and fading light. Kim Jong-un is calling for an exponential increase in his country's nuclear weapons arsenal, starting from 2023, and is building a fleet of super large, in quotes, mobile rocket launchers that could hit any point in the south with a nuclear warhead. In a report Thursday, South Korea Institute for Defense Analyses said that Kim's plan could manifest itself into 300 weapons in the coming years. It's a big step up from 2022 when the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute estimated he had 20 assembled nuclear weapons and enough fissile material to make up to 55. So if that were to take place, North Korea would have more nukes than France, the UK, and the UK, and it would be fourth in the world behind Russia, China, and the United States in terms of the size of their stockpile. And now, of course, the South Korean president wants his own military buildup in response. So we have an arms race going on through the Korean Peninsula and just across the Pacific, with Japan, China increasing their spending. I'm sure Russia is increasing their spending too. The most worrying part about it are these talks of sending tanks to Ukraine. So on January 16th, a high-level British general warned that sending 14 Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine could leave the British military temporarily weaker, says the Times. This is General Patrick Sanders, Britain's chief of general staff, said sending the tanks would leave a gap in the British military inventory and would make it hard for London to meet its NATO commitments. According to numbers from early 2022, the UK has 227 Challenger 2 tanks compared with over 6,000 main battle tanks that the US possesses. So it's interesting that even that amount seems to be kind of small. But 14 of 227 is it's a significant number, I guess, for the UK. And of course, Britain did pledge to send the 14 tanks, but it fell short of the 300 the commander of Ukraine's armed forces said he needs to have a chance of pushing Russia out of Ukrainian territory, which, I don't know, probably it does include Crimea, according to them, the Ukrainians, and it just doesn't really make sense. And so we're still stuck in this hard place where Ukraine refuses to negotiate with Russia in case these insane demands are met, like having Russia basically be submitted to war crimes tribunals and Russia evacuating Crimea and returning, I believe, to the 2014 lines, or at least to the pre-invasion lines. But Russia, for its part, has annexed those 4 areas of Ukraine and Crimea. So those 4 oblasts that they just had the referenda. Whatever you think about them, I think it's kind of dubious to think that it was an accurate representation of what the organic population of those oblasts want. I mean, we have a good idea of what Donetsk and Luhansk would like to do, but those other two oblasts, who knows? There's a war going on there, and I don't know if there have been any international inspections. So Rishi Sunak confirmed that he's pledged to provide Kiev with the British main battle tank, the Challenger 2. And so these are escalations, and it's unclear exactly what impact that this will have on. I mean, I don't think it'll have much impact actually on the ground, but it remains to be seen what Russia itself will do in response to this. So I think you have an idea here. Here's another article. New EU defense budgets, defense ministers passing budgets. And there was another piece I had here. NATO agrees on 2023 budgets reflecting higher ambitions for the new security reality. So we have everyone spending more money. And of course, it's not a surprising result of the invasion of Ukraine, everyone using it. And it could just, even if it was just a boon for the weapons makers and all this was just a plot to escalate, to make money, which it's not. I mean, of course, there's power differentials at play and empire and global domination, or at least aspirations for that. The rules-based world order led by the US, or an emerging multipolar world led by China and Russia and other rogue regimes, quote unquote, but other other kind of wild cards more so in the global south, perhaps you could say. Thinking, India and other nations as well. It's just failing me, nations and the African nations, but India is the major player. And thinking about exactly what they're going to do, they're in a weird place that I'd like to kind of analyze. But this is just the result that I guess you would expect from what's happening there. So my throat hurts, and I'm going to call it a day there. 54 minutes. I think that's a decent show. So again, sorry for kind of the lack of content that's been coming out. I've just been really busy and then dealing with illness, and I do have a project that I'm working on, but I'm not going to talk much about it until it's more advanced, because I know that I have all these aspirations with this show of what I'd like to do, and unfortunately the reality of my life just doesn't always allow me to get there. But so go on over to vitaldescent.com/243. Check out everything that we got over there. The antiwar.com is having a fundraiser right now, and let's just go to the main page. They have matching donations up to $25,000. So if you go on over there, you double your impact. They really rely on your guys' support. So head on over to antiwar.com/donate. And I got some more ideas for some shows coming up here, but we're going to leave it there for now. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you next time. Peace.